My session is on telling the full story, the process of changing from using user stories to use cases. And a little bit about myself. Lauren Kelly. I'm a senior engagement manager at Pantheon. I've been at Pantheon for 3 years now. Prior to that, I was a Drupal developer since 2007. And I crossed the line many times between developer and project manager. And this session really comes out of my experience there of the pain points that teams saw as a developer and as a project manager. So the topics I wanted to run through today are user stories, including their benefits and limitations, use cases, what and how and why to use them. Because in this process of giving this other times, people had questions about actors and personas. I wanted to also make sure we covered a little bit about that process, and then bringing it all together. And finally, at the end, I have some more resources and things that you might want to look at. So I wanted to start with, what is a user story? We all know this whole process, right? We get a new project handed to us. The team is really chomping at the bit. They're ready to go. They're excited. They want to start developing. So they write user stories. As a content editor, I want to associate images with events so that the correct images are used for an event. Great. Okay, that's a useless user story, but we'll get into that. User stories, incredibly simplified, if your team is really in a rush, will look something like this. As a user role, I want to do something. As a content editor, I want to associate images with events. This is useless. Could you deliver this? Could you actually, number one, could you scope this? Could you talk with your team and estimate the work? Could you deliver this with confidence that it would be accepted? This doesn't have enough information for that. So proper form is important. We need to add in the why, the value. Answering why helps determine if or when more information is needed. So as a content editor, I want to associate images with events so that the correct images are used for any given event. Again, this takes a little bit longer, but this really isn't quite enough information. Unless standards are enforced, user stories can be ambiguous. As a content editor, again, it's the same thing. We're just talking about the same ambiguous user story. I want to associate images with events so that the correct images are used for any given event. So what's the real purpose of this story? Could you actually deliver this? Again, could you deliver this with confidence that would be accepted? Could you accurately estimate its time or work? And no, this still is too ambiguous. So it really needs to be specific. As a content editor, I want to tag images with their associated event so that they can be consistently used in multiple locations on the site, reducing the chance of incorrect image being used for that event. So this is better, right? The scope of the story is configuring a system of tagging images. It needs to be in a method that allows use in a variety of ways, but creating those views or blocks or anything is not part of the scope of this. The tagging is the only part that's in scope for this. So you could probably be a little more confident with estimating and delivering this story. So user stories have benefits. They help with planning, they help with communication, and they help your developers focus on the tasks that they're working on. Instead of getting like some great idea for another solution and going off, they have a task right in front of them. So if we start with the planning, we can take a look and we can see that, if they're good user stories, they can be estimated and reliably used for sprint planning. For communication, their user stories are supposed to be written with non-technical jargon. They're supposed to be written in plain English, even though none of us talk like that. As a shopper, I want to purchase bananas, so that my kids can have fruit in their cereal. We don't talk like that. But it works. It's fairly generic. It keeps standards in place, and we can share these with stakeholders. And again, for focus, it allows the individual piece of work to be implemented. I've worked with a lot of developers, myself included, where it sometimes can be hard if there's something that you really don't want to be working on. It's very easy to get distracted with a fun thing. But if you have this as your deliverable, you have this story as your deliverable for that day or that week, you know you have to do that, and it's right in front of you as a deliverable. But they have limitations. In the most pure sense, user stories are meant to be selected for sprint development and discarded. They're not meant to be documentation for the project. I have seen and been a part of many projects where we put our user stories into whichever system, Jira or any of them, Trello, any. And as you move them across to complete, the teams count that as documentation of what work was done. That's not meant to be done like for the customer, for the end user. That's documentation of what work was done. And it's not meant to be used that way. The other problem is that teams are inconsistent. If the teams are inconsistent in standardizing on the structure, if they get lazy, it allows for scope creep very easily. And it's far too easy, and this is the biggest problem I had with it, and this is what I ended up really wanting to look for a better solution. If you use them as a checkbox of this work is done, this work is done, this work is done, you have a product, a site that you're delivering to your users that meets all of the requirements, but is horrible to use. That is just nobody bothered to look at the big picture. The project manager looked at it and said, great, all the work is done, fantastic. The tests all passed, fantastic, let's deliver it. And the customer goes in and is like, this takes me 30 minutes to make one content change. It's not functional. And that's what can happen with that. It's an easy way to create a monster. You can build piece by piece without looking at the system as a whole. And it turns into Frankenstein. Everybody does their own thing. Everybody does their own implementation in their own way. New stories get added to make up for shortcomings for past sprints where work was delivered but maybe not quite accepted. And then, you bring in a new team member and they have their own idea of how to do things. It just turns into a monster project. And again, the checklist, if you're working from user stories, it relies on the team to maintain that picture in their head as opposed to having it documented. So, there's better ways. Use cases help you look at the big picture. So if we back up a bit, if you consider each project as a story, and I love XKCD, so I was so happy to be able to put this in here. But if you consider each project a story, imagine if you didn't know all of the characters and their storylines, right? These are complex systems here. Every time a new character came into a scene, every time there was a new merging point in here, any of these, you would have to rewrite that section. You would have to continuously say, oh, this user's here, this character's here. Let's rewrite that scene again. Let's rewrite that scene again. Let's rewrite that scene again. And it's not practical for your team as developers. So use cases provide the storyline. Who will be doing what things, when, and where will they be doing those things? Having plan changes and knowing what updates need to be made makes projects so much easier. It can be used to ensure that new work doesn't require unexpected reworking of existing work. We all know, like projects, they tend to be live. They need a lot of work. You go back. Customers have new requests. You delivered everything and it was perfect, but now they have a new idea. So that's expected rework. Unexpected rework we want to avoid. So use cases. Talk about all of the actors, all of the systems, and all of the teams. So a use case is recorded in a few parts. The first is a diagram of all the interactions across actors and systems. So here we have one little piece. We're looking at use cases for event registration. So we have a couple actors here. We have, we have the site visitor, we have the content editor, we have the event coordinator, and they're all doing different things. The content editor wants to create an event, wants to be able to edit the event. The event coordinator wants to be able to share to social media. They want to be able to review registrants. All these things they want to be able to do. And the site visitor, of course, wants to be able to view the calendar, the event details. They want to be able to register for an event. So these are all pieces that we want to identify. This is very high level. These are great for sharing with with the stakeholders, just to be able to say, hey, is this everything? And sometimes this will be like, oh, what about this? What about this? So this is a great one to have a conversation with. It's not scary. We're talking about stick figures. It's really not scary. The next step, oftentimes, is a list that includes the steps performed by, we're going to pick one actor, the steps performed by the primary actor to achieve a goal. And then we're also going to make sure that we include the alternative steps, options you want users to have, and options that users might make by mistake, which is important. So here's one for if we took one of those stories that were one of those little bubbles from before. A site visitor registers for an event. I'm not going to read through this, but we're going to go through. They're going to visit the homepage. They're going to go into an event, and they're going to try to register for it. They're going to log in. They're going to update they're going to verify their contact information. Great. It's all good. But we also want to have the alternative flows. What if registration for the event is full? What if the site visitor updates their contact information instead of just confirming it? We're not going to go into those steps here, but these help us identify what other, this is a workflow, this will help us determine what other workflows we need. And we can refer to that. Once they're created, we can refer to them in here. And then finally, you have a document that contains the primary actor, the goal, the preconditions, the postconditions, and a definition of success. So we have our site visitor. We want them, success for this story is that they're able to register without assistance from support. I totally just made all this up. But the preconditions are that the event exists. Great, that's logical. And that it has open registration space available. Okay. And that the visitor has an existing account on the site. Those were all assumptions that were made in that last little workflow. Afterwards, we're going to define those post conditions for when it's completed. The site visitor is registered for the selected event. However, that's confirmed, but that should be confirmable. And the registration count for the event should be increased by 1. Or the available slots should be decreased by 1, however you wanted to do it, but that's the idea. So we have it all documented here. And again, this is fairly simple, and you could review this with a stakeholder. You wouldn't want to go through a whole stack of them, but if you had a question for your client about what was going to be delivered exactly, you could go to this and say, is this correct? Before you start the work. So, how do we know who the actors are for those diagrams and for further process here? We can discover those through the use of personas. So this is a bit of a segue from use cases. This is kind of another part of the project documentation process. But the persona, it's a fictional character with a whole life outside of your project, right? We want to know their name, their job. It's a complete fictional character that you're creating. We want to know what their previous experiences, what their motivations are, what their frustrations are. All of this is very important. And at least for some of you, I hope, sounds familiar, because this is what I spent filling out as a teenager. And so doing personas to me was like, oh, I've done this before. You're creating a D&D character for your website. So here we have a persona example. This is Emily. She wants to share her art with the world. Her goal is to find hosting for her new website. Her motivations: she wants affordable options, ease of use, support, stability. She doesn't like technical jargon and paying for things she doesn't need, and she has limited time for troubleshooting. These are all important things for us to know. She and her friend built the website on her computer. She's new to website ownership. She's new to hosting, all of this. And her background is 3D animation, landscape art, cake baking, and decorating, whatever. This is actually important, though, because if we think about it, this is somebody who actually probably has technical experience, but just not with hosting. They were able to create a website on their own. That's a step. But now they're looking for hosting. So we could take this person that we've created, we could take Emily, and we could use Emily as an example when we are coming up with our flows. We're not going to use Emily as an actor. We're going to use all of our personas. You're going to make multiple personas for each type of visitor you have. And like, instead of just saying site visitor, well, what type of site visitors do we have? If we have people like Emily, what if we have developers who are experienced? What if we have people who have never touched a computer in their life and are trying to figure this all out? We have all these different types of users. They're not individual actors. We're going to make one actor kind of out of all of them merged together. And so we want a few examples for each persona group, and we can collect those different, the types of users that you want to create personas for. Research with your stakeholders, right? You want to have a conversation with your stakeholder. Who are your users? Who are the people that you're looking for? And then we kind of just have examples in mind as we're coming up with what steps a site visitor might take. In the end, we can bring it all together to tell the full story. So we build out the use cases, and suddenly we're going to have a complete view of the project. We have detailed user stories that can be added to each use case, right? We have these, and broken down then into this, and we can come up with from each of these what the user stories are and what the deliverables actually are. As a site visitor, I want to view event details. Well, what does that mean and towards what end? And now we can do that accurately. We have a whole picture of what other pieces are affected by this. We have a picture there, an image of what is the full functionality that we're looking at to deliver. And we can go back to this and we can say to a stakeholder, which of these are most important to you? Which of these are priority? And if they say, obviously creating an event is a priority, we can say, okay, we have create event. Let's go then to the workflows for create event. Let's create the user stories for those and create our sprints for those. And we have everything we need for that piece to be delivered. And we can create our sprints then accurately with fewer blockers. We know from that process of looking at this, sorry to keep going back and forth, we know from that process of looking at this that we can't do, we can see on here, you can't do edit event before you do create event. I mean, that one's a no-brainer. But as we get more and more complex into projects, you can see here what things happen, and you can determine which things are blockers for others, and you can detail out those relationships. Oops. And the scope of the project has been thoroughly defined. You could reduce it down to a minimum viable product, right, to a minimal deliverable. You could expand it, and you can estimate the effect on the total system more easily. You have the whole project there. If you add on this piece, what other pieces is it going to affect? You can see that now. We also now have, from here, we have an outline for QA. The QA team, they can go ahead and they can turn this into testing scripts, or we can just, if you're not using scripts, automated testing, you could give this to your QA team and they have a workflow to follow that the developers didn't provide. This is done before development. So if the developers have done all of their work, this will happen. But if they've missed something, and again, this is from experience of being on projects where the tests came after development, well, everything passed because the developers said, this is what should happen. Finally, we have shareable documentation already done on the project. If you combine this, and with this piece, you actually have a full bundle of documentation that you can deliver that can be managed however the client wants, the stakeholders want, but they have full documentation. If they're done with you and 3 years down the line, they go to a new team, and I'm guessing we've probably all inherited Drupal sites. And it is incredibly difficult trying to figure out what was in somebody's mind when they did work. What were they thinking? If a team has this and they give it to a new agency, if you got this before you started work on a project, you would know what you were walking into. So there's downsides. It requires the team to slow down. Your developers were, the team lead was brought into the scoping or whatever, the estimating with the sales and stuff. They're really excited about the project. They have ideas about how everything is going to work. And then you tell them, okay, wait, let me get this stuff written down first. Then you can start. It's absolutely killer. It is brutal. It is the most painful thing ever. But it should get done. It's something that's important. It is time-consuming to do it right. And you need a system to keep all of this product documentation together, accessible, and most importantly, to me at least, alive. None of this should just be written and then saved as a PDF and stored somewhere. This should be a live document. All of these should be live documents that are updated as changes are made. It's really important that as you're making deliverables and new requests come in, and if we're talking about agile development, we're talking about like adjustments continuously, you have to update this documentation. Which comes to the next part. When you're doing this, you can't aim for perfection. And I have some quotes that struck me about it. The pursuit of perfection often impedes improvement. And if I waited for perfection, I would never write a word. You have to stop documenting at some point. You can't say, I'm going to document every step of this before we do anything. You have to get to a position where your team can start, and then you come back and keep adding it in and revisiting and revising. If the team finds something that was missed, you add it in. You check to make sure that it isn't affecting anything else. Update the other affected areas, and then you can adjust your upcoming sprints intelligently. You can make wise decisions for your team. And then you can keep being awesome and tell the whole story. And then these are some resources from online. Surprisingly, Wikipedia has awesome information on this. Usability.gov has some great information on use cases and personas. And then this is a book. I always forget what year it was written. It's not a very recent book. There may be a newer edition, but it is a fantastic book and a great resource. Be a contributor tomorrow. My goal always with this is to have a conversation with you about what's working for your teams and what's not working with your teams. And have any of you used use cases before? Yeah, most teams don't. Have you run into these problems with just using user stories? Yeah, and it's painful to slow down. I mean, to developers, it's painful to slow down to write user stories. They don't even want to do that. Imagine taking another step back and saying, wait, you can't even write user stories yet. Do you have any questions about anything, though?
So, it looks to me like by the time you're at this level of detail, you're only half a step away from doing some version of TDD, BDD. Why not just go there? Because I mean, it's super familiar. As a logged in, unregistered user on the event page, when I click this thing, do this thing, right? Write the test suite, it's integrated into the full picture of everything. My site needs its self-completing set of documentation, like it fits really well with this model.
But getting to that point, yeah, it does, and that's exactly it. You can take that step where you're writing the workflows, and you can completely go to that. But if you just started with that, you'd have pieces again that you're rewriting because you just realize there's some other complication there.
Okay. Do this, then the tests.
Yeah.
Then develop.
Or I mean, you could do this, have development happening, and have the tests being written. Whoever, I mean, depending on your teams and your structures, you could do that. So, okay. Yeah. Something I always forget to mention, use cases, and I didn't leave it out just like unintentionally. Use cases are separate from design. You can use these then to have discussions with your design team about how are we going to visually implement this on the site? What's the best way that we could, for user experience, what's the best way to implement this? That's a discussion you need to have with the design team and the UX team, but that's not for here. That's kind of, this is all technical documentation. Any other questions?
Who is expected to write use cases?
Delegate. It depends on your team size. I think you need to have one person who owns the project, who is going to make sure that everything is keeping that image in mind. So you're still at that point of you need one person who's competent and responsible, who's going to say, yes, we've got everything. I think depending on your dev team, you can actually delegate to some of them about like, oh, I've done this before. Okay, great. You've done this. Let's see what you come up with and review it. Sit down with them, collaborate. You don't have to do everything yourself. If you tried to write if you had one project manager who tried to write all this, it would be a year before you could start doing anything. I think you have to collaborate with your team and you have to delegate. Maintaining standards, though.